the earth, wind. So there's two real creation stories at the beginning. The newer one, which is the first one, and the older one, which is the second one. And the older one begins in chapter 2, and that's the story that we are getting into now. Adam and Eve are in that, Cain and Abel, Noah, the Tower of Babel, in the Yahwist strand, Exodus, Numbers along, and there's some of the priestly version in there too, as well as the 10 Commandments. Well, there's some lovely representations of paradise. This is Garden of Earthly Delights. What's his name? Say that. Bosch, yes. Hieronymus Bosch, yes. A crazy. I mean, how he didn't get burnt at the stake is absolutely beyond me. I mean, you know, some of you know about Salvador Dali, I suppose most of you do. I mean, Dali's a piker compared to Hieronymus Bosch, man. You could spend, because there's 3 pieces of this particular painting, you could spend a very bizarre and surreal month looking at that painting. I don't know what it was with Bosch, but he was some sort of creature that only popped up once, and probably for the best. And so there's been very many representations of paradise. I mean, God only knows what that is. It's like, I could probably guess, but I won't. And then look, I mean, that's the lion lying down with the lamb, right? So that's this idea that's maybe projected back in time, that there was a time, or maybe will be a time, when the horrors of life are no longer necessary for life itself to exist, right? And the horrors of life are, of course, that everything eats everything else, and that everything dies, and that everything's born, and that the whole bloody place is a charnel house, and it's a catastrophe from beginning to end. And this is the vision of it being other than that. And you know, there's a strong idea. This was also implicit in the alchemical ideas, and I think it's also implicit in the scientific revolution, that human beings can interact with reality in such a way so that the tragic and evil elements of it can be mitigated, and so that we can move somewhat closer to a state that might be characterized, well, that's obviously imagistic, but it might be characterized by something like that, where we have the benefits of actual existence without all of the catastrophe that seems to go along with it. And Carl Jung, when he wrote about the emergence of alchemy, or the emergence of science from alchemy, he thought of science as being motivated by a dream, because for Jung, the dream was the manifestation of the instincts. It was the boundary between the instincts and thinking. He said, well, science is nested inside a dream. And the dream is that if we investigated the structures of material reality with sufficient attention and truth, that we could then learn enough about material reality to alleviate suffering, right? To produce the philosopher's stone, to make everybody wealthy, to make everybody healthy, to make everyone live as long as they wanted to live, or perhaps forever. That's the goal, to alleviate the catastrophe of existence. And that idea, the idea that mysteries, the solution to the mysteries of life that might enable us to develop such a substance, or let's say a multitude of substances, provided the motive force for the development of science. And Jung traced the development of that motive force really over 1,000 years. And if you're interested in reading his books on alchemy, which are extraordinarily difficult, and that's really saying something about Jung, because all of his books are difficult, and then the books on alchemy, they kind of take a quantum leap. That's actually a very small leap, so I shouldn't say that. They take a massive leap into a whole different dimension of complexity, but that's what he was trying to get at. He went back into the alchemical texts and interpreted them as if they were the dream on which science was founded. And Newton was an alchemist, by the way. I mean, Jung's hypotheses are certainly well supported by the historical facts. Science did emerge out of alchemy. The question is, what were the alchemists up to? And they were trying to produce the philosopher's stone, and that was the universal medicament for mankind's pathology. Jung felt that what had happened was that, you know, Christianity had promised that, the cessation of suffering, promised it for 1,000 years, and yet suffering went on unabated. And at the same time, Christianity had attempted to really put emphasis on spiritual development, let's say, at the expense of material development, right? Thinking of material development as something akin to a sin, trying to get a control of impulsivity and all the things that went along with a two-embodied existence. There was a reason for it, but that by about 1000 AD, the European mind, somewhat educated by that point, somewhat able to concentrate on a single point, perhaps because of a very long history of intense religious training, turned its dream to the unexplored material world and thought, well, you know, the spiritual redemption that we've been seeking didn't appear to produce the result that was promised or intended, and so maybe there's another place that we should look, and that was in the damned material world, right? Which was supposed to be, at least according to some elements of classic thinking, nothing but the creation of the devil. So, but the point I'm making is that, you know, it's very difficult to underestimate the amount of human motivation that's embedded in the attempt to alleviate suffering, to eradicate disease, to help people live a healthy life, and well, that's the disease, obviously, but to live a long life as well, and to make things as peaceful as possible. I mean, you can be cynical about people, and you can talk about them as motivated by power and being corrupt and all of those things are true, but you shouldn't throw away the baby with the bathwater, because we have been striving for a very long time to set things right, and we've done actually not too bad a job of it for half-starving, crazy, insect-ridden chimpanzees with lifespans of 50 to 70 years. So, you know, we could deserve a bit of sympathy for our position as far as I'm concerned. So, some other representations. This one I like, the one on the left. That's paradise. Paradise as a walled garden, and that's what paradise means. It's paradisa, which is, I don't remember the language. It's associated with Persian. Paradisa means walled garden. And why a walled garden? Well, it goes back to the chaos order idea. So this is where God puts man and woman after the creation in a walled garden. Well, the wall is culture and order, and the garden is nature. And the idea is the proper human habitat is nature and culture in balance. It's, well, we like gardens. Well, why? Because, well, they're not completely covered with weeds and mosquitoes and black flies, right? So they're civilized a little bit, but still within that civilization, nature in its more benevolent guise is encouraged to flourish, and people find that rejuvenating. And so the idea that paradise, the proper habitat of a human being, is a walled garden is a good one. And it's walled because, well, you want to keep things out, right? I mean, raccoons, for example, you want to keep those things out, man, even though it's impossible. And you know, you don't want, well, there's all sorts of things you don't want in your garden, like snakes. Walls don't seem to be much use against them, but the idea that paradise is a walled garden is an echo back to the chaos order idea. Walls, culture, right? Garden, nature. So the proper human habitat is a properly tended garden. Now, the radical left-leaning, anti-theist environmentalists tend to make the case that the predations of the Western capitalist system are a consequence of the injunction that was delivered in Genesis by God to man to go out and dominate the earth. David Suzuki has talked a lot about this, by the way. They believe that that statement has given rise to our inappropriate assumption that we have the right to exert control over the world, and that that's what's turned us into these terrible predatory monsters, sometimes described as cancers on the face of the earth, or viruses that have inhabited the entire ecosystem, who are doing nothing but wandering everywhere and wreaking havoc as rapidly as we possibly can, which is another perspective on the essential element of humankind that I find absolutely deplorable. I mean, if you look at the historical record, for example, even casually, you'll find out that as late as the late 1800s, 1895, thereabouts, Thomas Huxley, who was Aldous Huxley's grandfather and a great defender of Darwin, prepared a report for the British government on ocean sustainability. And his conclusion was, fish away, guys, man. There's so many fish out there. The oceans are so inexhaustible that no matter how hard humanity tried for any number of years, the probability that we could do more than put a dent in what was out there was zero. Now, Huxley turned out to be wrong. He didn't realize that our population was going to spike so dramatically, partly because we got a little bit rich and our children stopped dying at the rate of like 60% before they were 1 year old. And, you know, we actually managed to populate the earth with a few people, but it wasn't really until 1960 or so that we woke up to the fact that there were so many of us that we actually had to start paying attention to what we were doing to the planet. And that's like, what, 50 years ago? Well, we've just started to develop the technology, the wherewithal to understand that the whole world might be well considered a garden, and we need to live inside the proper balance between culture and order, or culture and chaos. Before that, we were spending all of our time just trying not to die, and usually very unsuccessfully. So I don't agree with that interpretation of the opening sections of Genesis. I don't believe that it's given human beings the right to act as super predators on the planet. I think that instead the proper environment for human beings is presented quite properly as a garden, and that the role of people, and that's explicitly stated in the second story in Adam and Eve, was to tend the garden. And that means to make the proper decisions and to make sure that everything thrives and flourishes, and so that it's good for the things that are living there that aren't just people, but also good for the people too. So fine, I think we could at least note that that's a slightly different take on the story than the ultimately cynical interpretation that's so commonly put forward today.